The winter of 865 came upon Northumbria with a cold that seemed to carry voices from the underworld, a cold that penetrated stone and bone alike, settling into the marrow of every living creature that drew breath in that troubled kingdom. The fishermen along the eastern coast, those weathered men who read the sea as monks read scripture, noticed something peculiar in the behaviour of the gulls that season. The birds circled endlessly above the grey waters, crying out in patterns that the old women claimed spoke of blood yet to be spilled. In the great hall of Eoforwic, the city the Romans had called Iberacum, and which would one day be known as York, King Ælla sat upon his carved oak throne, drinking wine imported from the Frankish lands, utterly unaware that his death had already been set in motion across the cold North Sea, deliberated upon in timber halls where men spoke the old tongue and sacrificed to gods whose names made Christian priests cross themselves in fear. The story truly begins not in that winter, but in the previous autumn, when a ship had limped into an East Anglian harbour, its crew exhausted, its cargo hold empty save for chains and the lingering stench of captivity. The men who came ashore spoke in hushed tones of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Danish chieftain whose very name had become synonymous with the terror and glory of the Northmen, how he had been delivered into Ælla's hands through treachery and misfortune, how the Northumbrian king had not granted him the warrior's death that even enemies afforded one another in those brutal times. Instead, Ælla had prepared for Ragnar something that would echo through the centuries, a death so calculated in its cruelty that it transcended mere execution and entered the realm of deliberate humiliation. A pit, they said, filled with serpents, adders whose venom worked slowly, whose fangs delivered agony in measured doses, and into this writhing mass the ageing warrior had been lowered, bound and helpless, to die. Not as a wolf dies in battle, but as a mouse dies in a barn, poisoned and pathetic. Word of this execution travelled with a speed that seemed supernatural, carried by merchants and slaves, whispered in marketplaces and shouted in mead halls, crossing the Whale Road to reach the ears of those who mattered most. Ragnar's sons, each one a formidable warrior in his own right, each one carrying within him a fragment of their father's fierce spirit, that unquenchable flame that had driven Ragnar to raid the coasts of England and Francia, to carve his name into the memory of Christendom with fire and iron. Ivar, whom men called the Boneless for reasons that remain disputed even now, though some scholars suggest a condition that affected his legs, while others propose it referred to his serpentine flexibility in both body and mind, received the news while overwintering in Dublin, where Norse influence had already begun transforming the Irish settlement into a hybrid city of two worlds. His brothers, Halfdan, Ubba and Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye, the last bearing a mark in his iris that supposedly resembled a serpent coiled around itself, were scattered across the Scandinavian territories, each commanding loyalty from warriors, each holding lands and silver, each suddenly united by a purpose that transcended their individual ambitions. The Old Norse concept of vengeance was not simply an emotional response, but a sacred obligation, woven into the very fabric of their cosmology, where the dishonouring of one's kin created a spiritual debt that unbalanced the cosmic order until blood repaid blood, until the scales were levelled by deeds that matched the original offence in weight and consequence. To fail in this duty was to invite not merely social disgrace but spiritual contamination, to mark oneself as Ndinga, a being so contemptible that even the word itself carried a curse. This understanding drove the sons of Ragnar to action, with an inevitability that resembled fate itself, as though the Norns who wove the threads of destiny had already measured out Ælla's remaining days and found them pitifully few. The brothers sent messages through networks that connected the Norse world, communications carried by reliable men who knew the risks of bearing such summons, calling together not merely a raiding party such as might strike a monastery or a coastal village, but something unprecedented in scale and ambition, an entire army, a host so vast that chroniclers would struggle to capture its magnitude in their later writings, some claiming 20,000 men, though the true number, while certainly impressive, was likely somewhat smaller, perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 warriors, still an enormous force by the standards of 9th century warfare. The assembly point was chosen with strategic care, East Anglia, whose King Edmund ruled over fertile lands and prosperous settlements, but commanded military forces insufficient to resist the coming storm. The Great Heathen Army, as Christian chroniclers would name it, though to its participants it was the Mickle Heathen here, began gathering in the autumn months of 865, longships arriving day after day, beaching on shores that had known Norse raids before but never occupation on such a scale. These were not merely raiders seeking quick silver and a swift return home before winter closed the sea roads. These were warriors prepared for a sustained campaign, accompanied by blacksmiths to repair weapons and armour, by women who would tend camps and manage supplies, by horses shipped across the sea or seized immediately upon landing to provide the mobility that would prove crucial to their success. The army brought with it a sophistication in logistics that has often been underestimated by those who imagine the Vikings as undisciplined barbarians. They understood supply lines and fortification. They knew how to exploit political divisions within the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They possessed intelligence networks that informed them of internal conflicts and weak points in their enemies' defences. King Edmund of East Anglia faced an impossible choice when this army arrived in his territory, for he lacked the strength to drive them out but feared the consequences of appearing weak before his own nobles and clergy. The Danes, for their part, had no immediate interest in conquering East Anglia. Their eyes were fixed northward on Northumbria, where Ælla sat unknowing. But they needed winter quarters and provisions. They needed to rest horses and repair equipment. They needed time to weld their various contingents into a cohesive fighting force. Edmund negotiated, a decision that would later be remembered differently depending on who told the tale, providing the Danes with supplies and permission to establish a fortified camp in exchange for peace. Though peace purchased with tribute is merely delayed war, a lesson Edmund would learn within a few years when the Danes returned to demand his kingdom entire. The winter camp became a city of tents and timber, smoky with cooking fires, loud with the sounds of men preparing for warfare, the ring of hammer on anvil, the shouts of warriors practicing with sword and spear, the quieter conversations of chieftains planning a campaign that would require coordination between forces that owed loyalty to different leaders but shared a common purpose. Northumbria in this period was not the unified kingdom it had been in previous centuries, when it had stood as one of the great Anglo-Saxon powers, but rather a realm fractured by internal conflict between rival claimants and competing noble factions. Ælla himself had only recently secured his position through what amounted to a coup against the previous king, Osbert, who had not accepted his deposition gracefully but instead retreated with his supporters to nurse his grievances and plot a return to power. This division would prove fatal, for a kingdom cannot defend itself effectively when its warriors are divided in their loyalties, when its leaders regard each other with suspicion and hatred that sometimes exceeds their fear of external enemies. The Danes understood this weakness through their intelligence gathering, through conversations with traders and informants, through the age-old practice of exploiting Christian kingdoms' tendencies towards self-destructive internal warfare, while the pagan North maintained flexible alliances based on mutual advantage rather than rigid hierarchical claims. When spring came in 866, the Great Heathen Army moved north with a speed that caught the Northumbrians unprepared, advancing not in the slow, predictable manner of traditional armies, but with the rapid mobility that cavalry provided, supplemented by intimate knowledge of Roman roads that still crisscrossed the English landscape, those ancient stones connecting cities in networks the Empire had built centuries before, but which remained functional for those who knew how to use them. The Danes rode toward Eoforwic, the chief city of Northumbria, approaching it not directly but in a manner designed to confuse scouts and divide any potential defensive response, sending raiding parties in multiple directions to create the impression of a larger force distributed across a wider area than was actually the case. The city itself was still partially protected by Roman walls, though these had fallen into disrepair in the centuries since imperial administration had collapsed, leaving sections weakened and vulnerable, defensive works that might have withstood siege engines and organised assault but which could not prevent determined warriors from finding gaps and weak points, particularly when the defenders were few and poorly coordinated. The capture of Eoforwic on November 1st, 866, occurred with shocking speed, the Danes exploiting both the element of surprise and the disorganisation of Northumbrian defences pouring through breaches in the walls and overwhelming resistance before it could properly organise, seizing the city in a matter of hours rather than the days or weeks a proper siege might have required. Among the survivors who fled into the surrounding countryside were messengers who carried news of the catastrophe to both Ælla and Osbert, separate messages to separate courts, announcing that the chief city of the kingdom had fallen to foreign invaders who showed no signs of leaving, who were instead fortifying their position and settling in as though they intended Eoforwic to serve as a permanent base for operations. The fall of such a significant city, with its churches and monasteries, its mint that produced coins stamped with Northumbrian kings' names, its symbolic importance as a centre of Christian civilization in the north, represented a humiliation that no king could endure and retain legitimacy in the eyes of his people and peers. The crisis forced Ælla and Osbert into an alliance neither desired but both recognised as necessary. A temporary setting aside of their rivalry in the face of a threat that endangered them equally. For if the Danes could hold Eoforwic, they could unravel the entire kingdom, reducing Northumbria from a sovereign realm to a patchwork of isolated strongholds waiting for conquest. Through the winter months of 866 into 867, the two kings gathered forces, calling upon their nobles to fulfill their military obligations, assembling an army that represented the combined strength of Northumbria, warriors who set aside their allegiances to different claimants in order to confront the foreign invaders. The army that marched toward Eoforwic in March of 867 was substantial, perhaps numbering several thousand men, drawn from estates across the kingdom, equipped with spears and shields, swords for those wealthy enough to afford such weapons, armour ranging from simple leather to chainmail for the elite, all united in the belief that they would drive the Danes from their city and restore order to their troubled kingdom. The Danes within Eoforwic were not idle during these months, transforming the city into a fortress designed to withstand assault, repairing walls and gates, positioning defenders at strategic points, accumulating supplies to endure a siege if necessary, and most importantly, maintaining the unity of purpose that had brought the Great Heathen Army into being. The requirement that Ælla face justice for his treatment of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ivar the Boneless, whose tactical genius would become legendary, orchestrated the defence with an understanding of both Norse warfare traditions and the vulnerabilities of Anglo-Saxon military approaches, anticipating how Ælla and Osbert would attempt to retake the city and preparing responses that would turn their own momentum against them. The Danish position was strengthened by their control of the interior, by their ability to manoeuvre freely within the city, while forcing attackers to contend with walls and choke points, by the morale advantage that came from having already achieved a stunning victory, while the Northumbrians approached seeking to recover from a devastating loss. When the Northumbrian army arrived before Eoforwic on March 21st, 867, the spring equinox, a date that would be remembered in chronicles and later sagas as the day when the old gods exacted their price from the Christian king, the initial assault appeared to proceed favourably for Ælla and Osbert. Their forces found sections of the wall seemingly poorly defended, encountered less resistance than expected, managed to force entry into the city through gates that appeared to have been inadequately secured, penetrating deep into the urban landscape in a charge that felt like the beginning of a triumphant reconquest. What these warriors did not understand, could not have understood without intimate knowledge of Danish tactical thinking, was that they were being channeled, guided into a killing ground through paths that appeared to open naturally, but had in fact been carefully prepared, lured deeper into terrain where their numbers became a disadvantage rather than an asset, where streets too narrow for proper shield wall formation fragmented their cohesion, where defenders positioned on rooftops and in windows could rain down missiles upon them, where every corner might conceal an ambush and every advance forward meant leaving exposed flanks vulnerable to counterattack. The battle devolved into chaos, the Northumbrians realising too late that their apparent breakthrough was in fact a trap closing around them, finding themselves fighting not in the open, where they might have used their numbers effectively, but in confined spaces where Danish warriors, many of them veterans of countless raids and battles, could employ their superior individual fighting skills and their intimate knowledge of the urban terrain they had spent months learning. The slaughter was methodical and brutal, Northumbrian warriors dying in heaps as they tried desperately to retreat, to extract themselves from the trap, discovering that the paths they had used to enter were now blocked or defended by fresh Danish forces, that escape routes led only to dead ends or further killing zones. Among the dead that day was Osbert, the deposed king who had joined his rival in this ill-fated attempt to save their kingdom, cut down in the fighting, his body left among the countless others that littered the streets of Eoforwic. His blood mixing with that of common soldiers and nobles alike, all rendered equal in death. Ælla survived the initial slaughter, whether through skill at arms or mere chance, positioning him where the collapse occurred less catastrophically. But his survival proved temporary and, from the Danish perspective, providential. Warriors recognised him, seized him alive, dragged him before the sons of Ragnar who had orchestrated this entire campaign not merely to conquer territory or win plunder, but to exact vengeance for their father's death in that pit of serpents. The chronicles are careful in their descriptions of what followed, some written by monks who found the events too disturbing to record in detail, others by later Scandinavian poets who embellished freely. But beneath the variations runs a consistent thread. Ælla did not die quickly or cleanly, did not receive the mercy of a sword stroke or a spear through the heart. Instead, the sons of Ragnar subjected him to execution ritual that has echoed through history, with a horror that transcends the centuries, a method known as the Blood Eagle, though modern scholars debate whether this ritual was actually practiced or represents later literary invention, projected backward onto historical events. The description of the Blood Eagle, found in sagas written centuries after the events they purport to describe, involves cutting the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs through the resulting opening to create an image resembling wings spread in agony, a process that would cause unimaginable pain if the victim were kept alive throughout, though the physiological realities make sustained consciousness doubtful. Whether the historical Ælla died in precisely this manner, or whether later storytellers attributed this death to him as a narrative device to emphasise the magnitude of the son's vengeance, remains uncertain. But what cannot be disputed is that he died in Eoforwic in March 867, that his death was deliberately cruel, designed to balance the cruelty he had shown Ragnar, and that the Great Heathen Army considered his execution the fulfilment of a sacred obligation. The exact details matter less than the symbolic weight, the demonstration that even kings were not immune to retribution when they violated the codes that governed relations between warriors, that certain offences demanded responses that transcended political calculation and entered the realm of cosmic necessity. With Ælla's death, the immediate purpose that had brought the Great Heathen Army to England was accomplished, the debt to Ragnar's memory paid in blood and suffering. But armies do not simply dissolve once their initial objectives are achieved, particularly when those armies find themselves in possession of conquered territory, surrounded by wealthy kingdoms ripe for exploitation, commanded by leaders who recognised opportunity when it presented itself. The question facing the sons of Ragnar and their allies was not whether to continue their campaign, but how to expand it, how to transform a punitive expedition into a systematic conquest that would reshape the political geography of England. Northumbria, broken by the Battle of Eoforwic, its two rival kings dead, its military strength shattered, its nobility demoralised, no longer possessed the capacity for organised resistance, and thus fell under Danish control with minimal further fighting, though this control manifested not through direct rule, but through the installation of a puppet king, Ecbert, who would reign as a client of the Danes, collecting taxes on their behalf, maintaining order in their interest, preserving the forms of Northumbrian kingship while the substance of power rested with the foreign warriors who had conquered the realm. The transformation of Northumbria from an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom into a Danish client state represented merely the beginning of a broader process that would ultimately establish the Danelaw, that region of England where Norse law and customs would prevail, where Scandinavian settlers would establish farms and towns, where the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Danish cultures would create something new and hybrid. The other kingdoms watched developments in Northumbria with growing alarm, recognising that what had happened there could happen to them, that the Great Heathen Army represented a threat unprecedented in scope and staying power, different from the raids that had plagued coastal regions for decades but which had been containable, profitable for those who paid tribute but not existentially threatening. Mercia, the Midland kingdom that had often dominated Anglo-Saxon politics through the 8th and early 9th centuries, prepared defences under King Burgred, who understood that the Danes would inevitably turn their attention to his wealthy realm once they had consolidated their hold on Northumbria. The movement of the Great Heathen Army from Northumbria into Mercia in late 867 demonstrated the strategic sophistication that characterised their entire campaign, the Danes not launching a direct assault on Burgred's strongholds but instead manoeuvring to seize Nottingham, a fortified town of significant strategic value, establishing another base from which they could dominate the surrounding region and threaten further expansion. Burgred, recognising the inadequacy of his own forces, took the significant step of requesting aid from Wessex, the southern kingdom ruled by Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, who would later be remembered as Alfred the Great, though in 867 he was merely a secondary prince, untested and unknown beyond his own realm. The arrival of West Saxon forces to assist Mercia marked an important moment. The realisation among Anglo-Saxon rulers that the Danish threat required coordinated response rather than the isolated defence of individual kingdoms, though this understanding came late and would prove insufficient to prevent the Danish conquest of most of England. The combined Mercian West Saxon army that converged on Nottingham in 868 faced the same problem that had destroyed the Northumbrians at Eoforwic. The Danes had fortified their position, transforming the town into a stronghold that could not be easily taken by assault, and they showed no inclination to emerge and fight in the open, where the Anglo-Saxons' numerical advantage might tell. The result was a standoff. The Christian forces camped outside the walls, the Danes secure within, neither side willing to risk the casualties that a decisive engagement would entail. This stalemate was ultimately resolved through negotiation rather than battle, Burgred agreeing to pay tribute in exchange for the Danes withdrawing from Mercia, a settlement that purchased temporary peace but solved nothing fundamental, leaving the Great Heathen Army intact, mobile, and ready to seek opportunities elsewhere. The ease with which the Danes extracted payment without having to fight reinforced a lesson they had learned repeatedly, that Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would pay to avoid conflict, that their rulers valued short-term stability over long-term strategic positioning, that treasure could be accumulated through the threat of force rather than its actual employment. The Great Heathen Army returned to Eoforwic for the winter of 868–69, consolidating their control over Northumbria, extracting resources from the conquered territory, incorporating fresh warriors who arrived from Scandinavia now that word had spread of the army's successes and the opportunities available in England. The flow of reinforcements from across the North Sea was crucial to maintaining the army's strength, replacing casualties, adding specialised skills, bringing news from the homelands, and maintaining the cultural and spiritual connections that bound these warriors to their gods and traditions. Among those who arrived during these years were men who had become significant in their own right, chieftains and warriors whose names appear in later sagas, though separating historical figures from legendary inventions becomes increasingly difficult the further one moves from the contemporary chronicles and into the later literary elaborations. The year 869 saw the Great Heathen Army move against East Anglia, returning to the kingdom that had hosted them during their initial winter in England, but which had since, under King Edmund, apparently given the Danes reason for offence, though the sources are unclear about what specific provocation motivated the attack. The conquest of East Anglia proceeded with the grim efficiency that had characterised the Danish campaign thus far, the kingdom's defences proving inadequate against an army that had now spent years operating in England, that understood Anglo-Saxon military capabilities and political structures, that could move rapidly and strike decisively before effective resistance could organise. Edmund himself was captured, and his fate became the subject of hagiographical accounts written by later Christian authors who transformed his death into a martyrdom narrative filled with miraculous elements and pious speeches. The historical Edmund likely died in November 869, executed by the Danes for reasons that may have included his refusal to renounce Christianity, his failure to provide adequate tribute, or simply the practical consideration that leaving him alive as a potential focus for resistance would be strategically unwise. The later legends surrounding his death, which claim he was tied to a tree and shot full of arrows before being beheaded, echo the martyrdom of St. Sebastian and may represent literary borrowing rather than historical accuracy. but what remains certain is that Edmund died at Danish hands, that East Anglia fell completely under their control, and that the kingdom effectively ceased to exist as an independent realm, absorbed into the expanding Scandinavian-controlled territory. The manner of his death, whether the straightforward execution that practical military considerations would suggest, or the elaborate martyrdom that hagiographers later described, mattered less than the political reality that with Edmund's death, the Danes controlled two of the four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, held the initiative throughout eastern and northern England, and had demonstrated repeatedly that existing military and political structures were inadequate to resist them. The relentless expansion of Danish power brought the Great Heathen Army inevitably into conflict with Wessex, the southernmost of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the last remaining realm with both the resources and the leadership capable of mounting effective resistance. The movement into Wessex began in late 870, the Danes establishing a base at Reading, positioned strategically where the River Kennet met the Thames, providing water access and a defensible position from which to control the surrounding territory. The West Saxons under King Æthelred and his brother Alfred responded more aggressively than the Mercians or East Anglians had, launching attacks on Danish positions, fighting a series of engagements throughout 871 that demonstrated both the West Saxon determination to resist and the approximate parity of forces, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, battles won and lost by both parties in a grinding campaign that tested endurance and resources. Among these engagements, the Battle of Ashdown in January 871 stands out for the West Saxon victory achieved there, Alfred reportedly playing a crucial role in the fighting, though later sources inflate his importance in ways that reflect his subsequent legendary status rather than his actual position at the time as a secondary prince. The significance of Ashdown was not that it broke Danish power, it did not, but that it demonstrated Danish forces could be beaten in open battle under the right circumstances, that they were not invincible, that resistance was not futile even if victory remained uncertain. This psychological impact may have been more important than the tactical results, providing hope to the Anglo-Saxons that continued resistance might eventually succeed, that the Danish conquest was not inevitable, that the future remained contingent on decisions and actions yet to be taken. The death of King Æthelred in April 871, whether from wounds received in battle or from illness contracted during the campaign, elevated Alfred to the kingship of Wessex at perhaps the most dangerous moment in the kingdom's history, with Danish forces actively campaigning in West Saxon territory, with resources depleted by months of warfare, with the examples of Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia demonstrating what defeat meant. Loss of independence, foreign domination, cultural subordination. Alfred's early years as king were characterised by desperate defensive warfare, attempts to preserve his kingdom against an enemy that had conquered nearly everything else, buying time through both battle and tribute, learning through harsh experience the limitations of traditional Anglo-Saxon military organisation against the mobile, professional Danish warriors. The full story of Alfred's eventual success in preserving Wessex and beginning the long process of rolling back Danish control belongs to a later period and involves developments that extended beyond the original Great Heathen Army's campaign. But the foundation of that eventual West Saxon victory was laid in these early years when Alfred learned what worked and what failed against Danish tactics. The Great Heathen Army itself began to fragment in the early 870s, not through defeat but through success, as chieftains who had accumulated wealth and controlled territory began settling down rather than continuing the endless campaigning, transforming from raiders and conquerors into colonizers and farmers, parceling out land to their followers, and establishing permanent Scandinavian settlement in the regions they had conquered. This process, which historians call the land-taking, represented the transition from temporary military occupation to permanent demographic transformation. Norse settlers arriving to cultivate the lands their warriors had seized, establishing farms and villages, introducing Scandinavian place names and customs, creating the cultural hybrid that would characterize the Danelaw region for centuries. The army that had arrived in 865 with unified purpose divided into regional forces, some following Halfdan into Northumbria, where he distributed land among his followers in 876, others remaining with Guthrum, who continued campaigning against Wessex, still others joining new leaders as the original sons of Ragnar either died or faded from the historical record, their mission accomplished, their father's death avenged many times over. The question of what happened to Ragnar's sons after the initial phase of conquest reveals the fragmentary nature of our sources, chronicles that record events inconsistently, sagas that embellish freely, archaeological evidence that confirms Scandinavian presence but cannot speak to individual fates. Ivar the Boneless disappears from English sources after the early 870s, though Irish annals possibly reference him dying in Dublin in 873, suggesting he returned to his Irish power base once the English campaign achieved its primary objectives. Halfdan appears in sources through 877, associated with the settlement of Northumbria, but his ultimate fate remains obscure, some sources suggesting he died fighting in Ireland, others that he perished in conflicts with other Danish factions, none providing the clear detail historians prefer. Ubba may have died fighting in Devon around 878, killed in a battle against West Saxon forces, though even this identification remains tentative. The source is ambiguous about whether the Ubba mentioned in various contexts refers to the same person or multiple individuals bearing a common name. The revenge for Ragnar's death, however, extended beyond the execution of Ælla to encompass the transformation of England itself, the establishment of Scandinavian political control over vast territories, the settlement of Danish and Norwegian farmers across the Midlands and North, the creation of trading networks linking England to the broader Norse world of Dublin, Iceland, and the Baltic. In this larger sense, the Great Heathen Army accomplished far more than its founders likely envisioned, not merely punishing one king for one crime, but reshaping the political and cultural landscape of Britain in ways that persisted long after the army itself dissolved into history. The Danelaw that emerged from their conquests would endure as a distinct region, with its own legal traditions and cultural character, even after the eventual West Saxon reconquest, influencing the development of English law, language and society in profound ways that remain visible, in place names, dialect features, and legal customs preserved in medieval documents. The parallel between Ragnar's death in the snake pit and the serpentine nature of his son's revenge reveals itself in Contemplation. Where Ælla thought to end the threat posed by one aging warrior, he instead planted the seeds of his own destruction and his kingdom's conquest, the coils of vengeance tightening around him just as the serpents had constricted around Ragnar, the poison of his cruelty working its way through the body politic of Northumbria until the whole kingdom sickened and died. The Danes who settled in Yorkshire and the Midlands were not primarily the sons of Ragnar themselves, but rather the countless warriors who followed them, men seeking land and opportunity, fleeing poverty or violence in their homelands, drawn by reports of wealthy kingdoms ripe for conquest, motivated by individual circumstances far removed from the epic vengeance narrative that chroniclers emphasized. Yet these ordinary men, these farmers and traders who happened also to be warriors, accomplished the most complete revenge imaginable, not just killing one king, but replacing an entire social order, not just winning battles but settling the land, not just taking tribute but establishing permanent presence that would transform English culture forever. The Christian chroniclers who recorded these events struggle to understand them within their providential framework, interpreting the Danish conquests variously as punishment for Anglo-Saxon sins, as trials sent by God to test faith, as incomprehensible disasters that challenged their understanding of divine justice. The notion that events might be driven by pagan concepts of honour and revenge rather than Christian providence disturbed them profoundly, yet they could not deny the reality of what had occurred, could not explain away the collapse of ancient kingdoms before what they characterised as heathen barbarians. Some monastic writers detected in these disasters the approaching end times, reading the Viking invasions as signs of apocalypse, while others sought practical lessons about the need for military reform and political unity, their interpretations shaped by their theological commitments and their positions within societies struggling to survive. The archaeological record of the Great Heathen Army's campaign and settlement reveals dimensions invisible in the written sources, the material culture of daily life among both conquerors and conquered, showing patterns of trade and craft production, burial practices that blend Norse and Christian elements, evidence of violence in mass graves and destruction layers at some sites, but also evidence of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange at others. The excavation of Danish winter camps has uncovered blacksmithing facilities, gaming pieces, personal ornaments, and agricultural tools alongside weapons, painting a picture of an army that was also a mobile community, bringing with it the infrastructure necessary for sustained campaign and eventual settlement. These material traces confirm what the chronicles suggest, but also complicate simple narratives of invasion and conquest, revealing instead a complex process of interaction, adaptation, and gradual transformation occurring at different speeds in different regions depending on local circumstances. The memory of Ragnar and his sons entered the realm of legend even before the historical events had concluded. Oral traditions circulating among Norse settlers, stories told in mead halls and around hearth fires, gradually accumulating embellishments and supernatural elements, merging with older mythological patterns, transforming historical individuals into archetypal heroes whose deeds illustrated timeless themes of honour, revenge, and destiny. By the time these stories were finally written down in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries after the events they purported to describe, separating historical kernel from literary elaboration had become essentially impossible, the saga authors drawing on multiple traditions, creating coherent narratives from fragmentary sources, prioritizing dramatic effectiveness over historical accuracy because their purposes were literary and moral rather than scholarly. The Ragnarsona Thatir and related texts present versions of events that contradict the earlier chronicles in various details, while preserving possibly authentic traditions unknown to contemporary written sources, creating the methodological challenges that make Viking Age history simultaneously fascinating and frustrating for modern researchers. The question of whether Ragnar Lothbrok himself was a historical figure or a legendary composite remains contested among scholars, some arguing that the sources point to a real 9th century Danish chieftain whose exploits were later exaggerated, others maintaining that the name accumulated deeds originally attributed to multiple individuals, creating a fictional character whose historical existence cannot be verified. The same ambiguity attaches to various specific episodes in his supposed career: the raid on Paris, the marriages to Lagertha and Aslaug, the famous speech in the snake pit, events that may reflect actual occurrences or may represent narrative motifs drawn from other contexts and attached to Ragnar's legend. For understanding the Great Heathen Army, however, the historicity of Ragnar matters less than the fact that 9th century Danish warriors believed in him sufficiently to cite his death as justification for their campaign, that his sons were recognised as leaders of forces that unquestionably did invade and conquer much of England, that the revenge narrative provided ideological coherence to what might otherwise have appeared as opportunistic aggression. The fate of those who participated in Ragnar's execution beyond Ælla himself remains largely unknown, the sources focusing on the king while leaving his servants and executioners anonymous, though one might reasonably assume that any who fell into Danish hands after Eoforwic's capture met unpleasant ends, their involvement in the snake pit execution marking them for retribution. The destruction of Northumbria's political elite extended beyond the royal family to encompass the nobility, who had supported or acquiesced in Ælla's actions, the systematic replacement of an entire ruling class through death and dispossession, exile and marginalisation, Danish chieftains and their followers moving into estates whose previous owners had fled or died, assuming control of agricultural production and administrative functions, inserting themselves into existing social hierarchies while also transforming those hierarchies through their presence. This process of elite replacement, documented in later land charters and Domesday book entries that reveal Scandinavian names among property holders in regions the Great Heathen Army conquered, represents the most thorough revenge imaginable, not merely punishing individuals but erasing the social order they represented, replacing it with one built on different foundations, organised around different principles, oriented toward different cultural centres. The winter of 872–73, with the Great Heathen Army in winter quarters at Torksey and Lindsey, marked a moment of transition, the army at the height of its power, controlling territory from Northumbria through Mercia into East Anglia, having demonstrated the inability of traditional Anglo-Saxon military organisation to resist sustained Scandinavian campaigning, yet also approaching the point where continued unified action would give way to fragmentation and settlement. The discovery of thousands of artifacts at the Torksey site through metal detector surveys has provided unprecedented insight into the army's composition and activities, revealing evidence for extensive metalworking, trading goods from across the North Sea world, gaming and leisure activities, religious practices that included both pagan and Christian elements, the full spectrum of daily life in a Norse military camp. The sheer quantity of material recovered suggests a force of considerable size occupying the site for an extended period, transforming the local economy through their demands for food and supplies, their participation in trade, their interactions with the existing population. The relationship between the Great Heathen Army and the existing inhabitants of the territories they conquered varied considerably depending on local circumstances, personal choices, and the specific phases of conquest versus settlement. The initial invasion clearly involved violence, the battles that broke Anglo-Saxon military resistance, the executions of kings and nobles who resisted, the seizure of property and resources necessary to sustain the army. But this phase of active warfare eventually gave way to accommodation and coexistence in most regions. Danish settlers and English farmers finding ways to live alongside each other, conducting trade, sometimes intermarrying, creating the hybrid Danelaw culture that would characterise the region. The sources offer glimpses of this accommodation, legal texts that prescribe different compensation rates for Danes and English, suggesting recognised ethnic distinctions but within a common legal framework. Place name evidence showing Danish and English settlements in close proximity, archaeological evidence of cultural mixing in burial practices and material culture. The process was neither uniformly peaceful nor universally violent, but rather exhibited the complexity characteristic of all conquest and settlement, characterised by variations dependent on countless local factors that the surviving evidence can only partially illuminate. The culmination of the initial phase of conquest came with the division of Mercia in 877. The kingdom partitioned between a western portion that remained under Anglo-Saxon control under King Ceolwulf, who ruled as a Danish client, and an eastern region that was distributed among Danish warriors for settlement, much as Northumbria had been divided earlier. This partition formalised the political reality that had emerged through years of campaigning, acknowledging Danish control while preserving the fiction of Anglo-Saxon kingship in regions where Danish settlers were fewer and where maintaining existing administrative structures served Danish interests better than attempting direct rule. The settlement in Mercia followed the pattern established in Northumbria, land distributed to warriors who had participated in the conquest, creating a class of Scandinavian landholders who would form the basis for the permanent Norse presence in England, their descendants becoming part of the complex ethnic mixture that characterised medieval English society. The character of this settlement has been debated extensively by historians and archaeologists, some emphasising the military nature of the initial land distribution, warriors receiving estates as reward for service, others noting evidence for family migration and agricultural colonisation, suggesting a broader demographic movement beyond just warrior settlement. The truth likely encompasses both elements: an initial phase of military land-taking, in which warriors associated with the Great Heathen Army received substantial estates, followed by secondary migration, as news of available land attracted farmers and craftsmen from Scandinavia, younger sons seeking opportunities unavailable at home, families fleeing local conflicts or environmental pressures, the full range of motivations that drive migration in any period. The result was the establishment of a substantial Scandinavian population in eastern and northern England, sufficiently numerous to influence language development, dense enough to alter place names across entire regions, integrated enough into the broader social fabric to persist even after the eventual political reconquest of the Danelaw by West Saxon kings. The continuing campaign against Wessex under Guthrum represented the last major unified operation by forces that could trace their lineage to the original Great Heathen Army, the final attempt to complete the conquest of England by subduing the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The campaign that began in earnest in 875 involved a new strategy, combining military pressure with political subversion, attempting to overwhelm Alfred's defensive capabilities through multiple simultaneous thrusts, winter campaigning that caught the Anglo-Saxons unprepared. raids on royal estates that struck at the economic foundations of West Saxon resistance. The near success of this campaign, with Alfred driven into hiding in the Somerset marshes in early 878, suggested that Wessex might follow the same path as the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, falling under Danish control and effectively ending independent Anglo-Saxon political existence in Britain. Alfred's survival and eventual victory at the Battle of Edington in May 878 reversed this outcome, the West Saxon forces defeating Guthrum's army decisively enough to force negotiations, resulting in the Treaty of Wedmore that established formal boundaries between West Saxon territory and the Danelaw, recognised Danish control over the territories they had conquered while securing Wessex's independence, and required Guthrum's baptism as a Christian, though how much this latter provision affected actual religious practices among the Danish population remains questionable. The treaty represented less a final settlement than a mutual acknowledgement of military stalemate, neither side capable of destroying the other, both willing to accept partition as preferable to continued warfare, though both also maintained ambitions that would eventually lead to renewed conflict in subsequent generations. For Guthrum, the treaty secured recognition of Danish conquests, transformed him from foreign invader to legitimate king ruling territory in his own right, provided the stability necessary for the consolidation of Scandinavian settlement in East Anglia, where he established his base. The death of Guthrum in 890, by which time he had ruled East Anglia for over a decade, marked the end of the generation that had constituted the Great Heathen Army's leadership. The warriors who had arrived in 865 motivated by revenge for Ragnar's death, having either died, retired to their estates, or been transformed into something other than the mobile conquerors they had been in their youth. The army itself no longer existed as a coherent entity, having fragmented into regional forces, settlement communities, and new formations as fresh arrivals from Scandinavia brought different leadership and different objectives, but its legacy was undeniable. The Danelaw existed, Scandinavian culture and population were permanently established in Britain. The political map of England had been redrawn in ways that would influence its development for centuries. The revenge for Ragnar's death, initiated with Ælla's execution in 867, thus extended across more than 2 decades of campaigning, conquest and settlement, accomplishing far more than the original participants could have envisioned, transforming a punitive expedition into a historical transformation of enormous magnitude, replacing Anglo-Saxon hegemony in northern and eastern England with Scandinavian control, introducing Norse language, law, and culture into regions where they would take root and flourish, creating the conditions for the eventual formation of a unified English kingdom through the process by which Alfred's descendants would gradually reconquer the Danelaw and forge a single realm from multiple ethnic and cultural traditions. In this sense, the Great Heathen Army's invasion, sparked by the desire to avenge one man's death, became one of the pivotal events in English history, its consequences rippling forward through time in ways that touched every aspect of the nation's development, from language to law, from settlement patterns to social structures, from cultural identity to political organisation, a revenge that transcended its personal origins to reshape the destiny of an entire island.